Welcome to the Hegel webinar. This time we're going to be talking about probably the most famous idea that Hegel has, a little bit undeservedly because there's a lot of other great stuff in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, but that's what we're going to be focusing on. Before we begin, we're going to get familiar with the technology for those who haven't been in on this. I'll do some introductions and some opening questions, and then we'll jump right into some lecture about the text, and we'll do some discussion later. What I want to do is situate this section first in the greater work of the phenomenology, and then talk about the things that lead up to the master-slave dialectic, and then talk about the actual master-slave dialectic itself. And we'll have about 20 minutes of time at the end for open discussion and Q&A. Using the technology, if you're not talking, you want to mute the microphone because we are recording this. You want to use headphones when your mic is on, otherwise you're going to get a lot of feedback. And then you can ask questions or make comments in two different ways. You can use the microphone or use the chat interface. I'll be checking both of those since Andy isn't here, and I'll read any questions that people have in the chat interface out loud. But like I said, we'll take questions at the end. So let's do some introductions. The person that we're focusing on is this guy, we usually just say GWF Hegel, right? Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. It's quite a mouthful. And he is a really, first-rate philosopher, but he's also very difficult. He's a key figure in this tradition that we call German idealism, and his early work that tends to draw the most notice in our century and also the century before is the Phenomenology of Spirit. I would say that in his own time, it was less the phenomenology and more his two logics and the philosophy of right that drew a lot of attention. I'm Greg Sadler. I'm the president and co-founder of ReasonIO. I'm also, as I think probably most of you know, the producer of the half-hour Hegel commentary series, which is a set of videos going through Hegel's phenomenology, one paragraph or two paragraphs at a time, in half-an-hour chunks. We're now about 3.5 years into the project, and we've got about another 2 years to go to finish it out. So let's talk first about how we situate this master-slave dialectic within the text of the phenomenology itself. Where does the master-slave dialectic fit into this larger text? Now, I think a lot of people perhaps, when they first hear about it, they don't realize that it's actually just a small part of a fairly short portion of a giant work. So the master-slave dialectic is part of the self-consciousness section, and the self-consciousness section is actually one of the shortest pieces within the work. It is a very important treatment of how human self-consciousness develops, and it does set the stage for what follows, but it's not Hegel's last word on human relations or even on how labor works or social dynamics or anything like that. And it's incomplete in how it winds up. It like I put here, it provides one incomplete culmination for a much larger problem in Hegel's text, and that is what we call the problematic of self-consciousness and recognition. So that's kind of a lot of jargon there. We'll go into that and talk about what that means. And it's followed by a much longer section of self-consciousness, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you want. That part is called Stoicism, Skepticism, and the Unhappy Consciousness, and it outlines three, you might say, basic attitudes that arise within ancient culture for how how self-consciousness develops beyond the master-slave dialectic. So right there, that should show us that the master-slave dialectic is not the final word. If you look at this slide, I've taken the structure of the phenomenology and kind of zeroed in on the master-slave dialectic. So you notice that we begin with a preface and introduction. The preface is actually pretty long. It's about 1/11 the length of the work. So that's a very long preface. And then we have this consciousness section, and there's a lot going on in there. One of the most difficult portions of the work, Force and the Understanding, is found at the end of the consciousness section. Then we have self-consciousness, and that's a fairly short section. You notice master-slave is situated right in the middle of that, sandwiched between the truth of self-certainty, the introductory stuff, and Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness. And then we have these other sections: reason, spirit, religion, absolute knowing. Of those, the only one that's actually fairly short is the absolute knowing, which is the end section. And that's sort of the make or break point of the work. If you've been following with Hegel all along up to that point, you might still say, I don't completely buy it. The religion section is pretty long. Spirit and reason, each of those is over 200 paragraphs, so each of them is a giant portion of the work. Right now, in the half-hour Hegel project, we're actually at the early parts of the spirit section. So you can see, where the master-slave dialectic fits in. It's very early on in the work, and it's part of this self-consciousness portion. So let's take a look at what's going on in that section before we actually get to the master-slave dialectic. So here he's talking about life, desire, the nature of self-consciousness, and we're looking at paragraphs 166 to 177. So here's some questions that we can start with. When we think about self-consciousness, we're already being self-conscious. And, it can lead to a kind of vertigo. We start realizing that we're thinking about thinking. It makes things rather complicated for us. But this is also something that we're able to do all the time as human beings. Every time that you think to yourself, I am late, what are people going to think of me? You are engaged in self-consciousness, and in a rather explicit way. So the question that we want to think about is, what does it mean to be self-conscious as opposed to being merely conscious? What is it to be conscious of yourself as opposed to being conscious of an object? And we also want to try to retain what I've put here as the movement, the fluidity, the reflexivity of self-consciousness. That's important in any account. We don't want to try to reduce self-consciousness to another kind of object, or to, say, a set of algorithms, as we might think about today, where everybody is particularly interested in modeling things. And the question that Hegel is going to be concerned with is whether self-consciousness can be something entirely self-contained, identical to itself, secure in itself, something that can be independent on its own. And a few key ideas that are going to come up that I think you may have encountered in other places. So Hegel has a contrast that runs throughout the entire phenomenology, and sometimes it means a little bit different things in other places, between being in itself or being for another, and then being for self. And you might say, that's very abstract. What does that mean? Well, here would be a concrete example. Being in itself is the kind of being that objects have for us, which means they're being for another. They're being for our consciousness. When I think about my phone, even if I talk to Siri or something like that, I don't really think Siri is a person. I think Siri is a nice set of algorithms. I'm treating that as something that really just has being for me. Now, if I find myself, I suppose, getting into some sort of projected relationship with Siri and worrying about what she thinks or he thinks or whatever, then I'm projecting something like being for self onto that artificial intelligence. Most of the time that we're doing this, we're thinking about our own self and we're what we make of ourselves. And Hegel says something really cool here in paragraph 167. He says, with self-consciousness, we have entered the native realm of truth. And this brings up another key idea. In the Hegelian dialectic, as you see it working its way through, there's this constant back and forth where Hegel will begin from a starting point of certainty or let's call it apparent certainty, something that we can take for granted, and we think we can work our way outward from there. And so we do, and we try to think our environment or our relations with others, what it is that we're doing from this basis of certainty. And in the process, we start to encounter what you might call the demands of something else, which is truth. We want to have a coherent view on things. And as we're doing the work of developing that coherent view, the certainty starts to vanish. We become less sure of ourselves. We're now able to develop further and develop our accounts further. But we lose that certainty when we attain the truth, and we want to find a way to bring those two together. And you see this playing itself out existentially in human lives, for example, when a person is digging into their past and the things that they thought they were absolutely certain about fall away, but they attain a kind of truth that requires them to grow, or at least to perhaps grow around like an oyster around a pearl. Now, the other key idea that is running throughout this is Hegel talks about self-consciousness being desire in general, and the German word for that is Begierde, which can also mean hunger. And this means that self-consciousness is not just, consciousness in the sense of representation or modeling or replicating what it's encountering, or even doing so in a reflexive way. It's also shot through with desire, with affectivity, with an orientation towards things. There's going to be some agency involved. So when Hegel talks about life early on in this section, he says that life in general differentiates itself into a plentitude of living things, all sorts of different living things. And the question is, how do we bring that movement back together? Self-consciousness is a particular kind of life in this section for Hegel, and he says that it exists through superseding its other. And you notice there's that term Aufheben, which is difficult to translate. Sublation is how it gets translated in a lot of cases. And you might think of superseding here as not just nullifying, but rather as integrating, as taking in what's essential in what is being superseded and retaining it and making it part of a larger framework. And the question is, how do you do that with an other? How do you do that with another person? This is where the master-slave dialectic is going to be showing us one way that can happen. There's also a problematic involved in otherness itself, and that gets explored in paragraphs 175 and 176. If we had to sort of put it in a bullet point form, it's that self-consciousness, it can only really attain its satisfaction, what it is that it's looking for, in another self-consciousness, not just in itself, in a totally isolated or even narcissistic way. It has to engage the other as other, but that always places it at a kind of risk. Self-consciousness is also looking for something that will be, you might say, a stable set of relations. It's seeking what Hegel calls recognition. And his word for recognition is anerkennen. It means to know. When we talk about really knowing somebody else, and we don't just mean knowing things about them, but actually knowing who they are, and for good or bad, and seeing the kind of person that they are, and acknowledging it. That's what he's talking about there. And that's something that Hegel thinks that all self-consciousnesses really are desiring. They don't always attain it. Oftentimes, they may not be developed enough, or society may not be developed in such a way as to allow them to have that recognition, but it's something that's fundamentally motivating us. So this brings us to the struggle for recognition. And now we get into the master-slave dialectic, proper, but this is really the lead up to it. I mean, he's paragraph 178 and onward, he's talking about this is all part of the lordship and bondage, or master and slave section. But we don't yet have a master and slave. again, we should think about a few starting questions that can help us. If we look at our own present era, what are we doing when we try to attain recognition? Is it something like what Hegel's describing here, or is it something that's a bit more complex or advanced? Another thing to think about is what happens when a person gets forced into a position where they're not recognized, which is the case oftentimes. There's many of us who are forced into being bit players at best, or whose, say, labor is exploited, or who wind up, being repressed or ignored. And then, the other question: why is it so important that there's an other involved? Why can't you just say at this time, provide recognition for yourself, perhaps through the intermediary of technology or some other similar thing? Now, Hegel himself, this is something I wanted to call your attention to. This is a little bit of a digression, but I think people may find it interesting. Hegel is going to talk about the relation to the other in terms of this doubling. And he uses a lot of plays on words. So there's Verdopplung, which is a doubling or duplication. He talks in terms of something being ambiguous, gedoppelte. He also talks in terms of what the German word for ambiguity, Doppelsinn is. And if you look at the Greek root, ambiguity has the same sort of sense. It's coming from ambo, which means both. And so an ambiguity is where something can be looked at in two or more ways. Self-consciousness itself is doubled and ambiguous, he tells us. It's doubled within itself. So it doesn't have a completely stable identity that it can rely upon or which it could represent to itself and that actually be the true thing. He also talks about it being doubled in its own meaning, and then it gets even more complicated. It's doubled in another self-consciousness, namely the other. And think about it this way. Everything that's going on the one side of self-consciousness is going on the other side of the other self-consciousness. And so there's something you might think of as almost like a feedback loop happening that's involved with this. So all that stuff said, we can come back to the actual development. What's actually happening here, according to Hegel? So both self-consciousnesses are going through this process of doubling and sort of losing what it is that constituted their, at least what they felt like to be a stable identity. There's a really nice sum up, like I put here in the short paragraph 183. So I'm just going to read this. Thus, the action has a double significance, not only because it is directed against itself as well as against the other, but also because it is indivisibly the action of one as well as of the other. So the action that's involved here, which is a kind of primal action on the part of both self-consciousnesses, is not only directed against the other person, but also, you might say, redounds to oneself, and it's the same action that both of them are engaging in. Each self-consciousness winds up being made what Hegel calls, and he really loves to talk in these terms throughout the entire phenomenology, the middle term, the thing that is unifying them. So that's actually worth pausing on a minute. What does he mean by saying it's the middle term? Didn't we have each self-consciousness on the opposite side from each other? Yes, and so to say that each of them is the middle term means that each of them is mediating between themselves and the other, and is being mediated by the other in that way as well. You could say that we can only really be ourselves when we're in some sort of productive relationship with the other. And here's where it comes to the crux. Each of these self-consciousnesses wants to be securely recognized. It wants to have its certainty, but it doesn't yet have what Hegel calls truth. So how is this going to show up? Each of them has to show its independence in relation to life, So here's where I think some people might say, well, I don't understand why it has to go this way, Hegel. Couldn't they maybe work something out between them, like a nice contract or something like that? Well, Hegel doesn't consider that. He says each of them seeks the death of the other, and they do so by risking their own life. So there's still this, reciprocity going on. And there's an interrelationship between genuine human freedom and this risk of putting one's life on the line. Now, if they happen to kill each other, or if one of them kills the other, then all bets are off, and there is no dialectical advance. However, if one of them does something different, and this is where we get to the dialectic of master and slave, now we have an advance. So here, Hegel talks about there being a vital difference between the two self-consciousnesses. Vital in a couple different senses that we can explore later if you want to. One of them displays a full indifference and thereby enacts its own freedom towards death. The other one wants to live more than it wants to be independent, and it gives in out of fear for its own existence. So what do we have here? This is a primal moment for Hegel where one of the consciousnesses becomes independent. Its essential nature is to be for itself, and he becomes the lord or master. The other one becomes dependent, and it's given its life, but it is for another. It becomes, the older translation is the bondsman, or, now the more modern translation, slave. So the master is able to engage in enjoying the world and consuming the world through the slave. And he does this in two ways. He gets recognition from the slave. So the slave is telling the master whatever it is that the master wants to know about himself, perhaps not necessarily through words, but sometimes just through what they wear, what they have to do, what the master can impose upon the slave. And at the same time, the slave is working on things and giving those to the master, who then enjoys it. And so, the master is at first, at least, fundamentally motivated by something going beyond the kinds of goods that we usually attribute to people who like to be in charge. It's not just power, it's not just pleasure, it's not just greed. For Hegel, recognition is at the very center of things. But the recognition that the master can get is going to slip away. And the slave is going to be developing in ways that escape what's going on with the master. So we need to look at that side. So the slave is put to work on things, and we might think of all sorts of examples. Let's say we take somebody who has to create clothing, or who is stuck cooking the meals, cleaning up, all those sorts of things, right? The slave works with things that are independent of them. I mean, everybody who's worked a crappy job, where you're dealing with tools, or dealing with, making food or cleaning things up, exactly what it's like to have the world resist your activities, right? And you're able to impose some order on it, perhaps, but it's never exactly what you were thinking of. So the slave is going through a kind of apprenticeship, not from the master, but from the things that they're working with. They're also having to develop because of this deferment of desire. And this is where things get really interesting. So what does the slave desire? The slave desires the same kind of recognition that the master is getting, which the slave is not going to get. They also have desires for other things, more common desires. The slave would like to sleep in. The slave would like to eat nice food. The slave would like to enjoy the sorts of things that everybody else in that society does, and the slave has to put that off. So that allows the slave to develop. So the slave is encountering and negating the independence of the things that he works on. And his work forms and shapes things, individual things, but eventually shapes an entire social world in which both master and slave exists. So the slave, and here's where, this is distinctively human. The slave works upon himself between the master and the object. And what's going on there? The slave is actually attaining a kind of agency conditioned agency, to be sure, because he probably wouldn't be doing this stuff if the master wasn't saying you need to do this or I'll injure you or hurt you. So here's another key element, what Hegel calls the fear of the Lord. He talks about an initial fear of death that shakes the very being of the slave, and Hegel thinks that this is absolutely essential. He says everything solid and stable has been shaken to its foundations. There's kind of a pure negativity, or we might think of it as a pure plasticity of the human being. And by itself, this negativity of fear doesn't really accomplish anything. It just scares the hell out of him and makes him malleable. What has to make this something where development can take place is the internalization of the master, the internalization of the lash it's been put, the punishment. So there's three things that are necessary for the development of this independent being. Fear, a fear that shakes him to the very core. Being put to work in terms of service, the relationship to the master, serving that person or that class, or however we want to think about it. And then work as formative activity. And Hegel says that if we don't have these, the slave still remains determinate being in the form of self-will or obstinacy, as he sometimes translates it as well. So without that, there's no dialectical development. With those things, there is a dialectical development. So this is a lot. We're a little bit past the time that I was going to take up, but this gives us plenty of time for Q&A till about maybe 12:45, or if need be, even 12:50. I'm going to unmute everybody.
I want to ask a question.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Okay. The master, later on, they have the unhappy consciousness.
Yeah.
Would be the master can be considered the pure category?
Well, in the master-slave dialectic, once he's actually established some sort of order and put the slave to work, the master really doesn't do anything. They just enjoy and they don't develop in any important way. Later on, you're right, in the unhappy consciousness section, we get a different kind of master who turns out to be the self-consciousness is sort of you could say this is the wrong way to put it, but breaks off a portion of itself and projects it out there into some beyond, and then tries to reach it. I mean, this is actually what Feuerbach discusses in his works, because he seems to fixate almost exclusively on that part.
Yeah.
But so they're not the same master, really.
Oh.
And even the master in the master-slave dialectic, they're all subject to another master, which is death.
Yeah, the absolute master, yeah.
Yeah. So the master who gets, going back to the master-slave dialectic, the master who gets to enjoy the good life and use slaves as technology and make them work on things, he's just a dead end dialectically.
Yeah.
And we have lots and lots of people like that. I mean, if we want to try to apply this to the present, we might think of people who are just involved in consumption and enjoyment.
Yeah.
And, they think themselves like totally entitled to it.
Yeah.
But, they're not going to leave any sort of mark on the world or history other than making people do things.
The reason I asked, because when I was reading the Freedom of Self-Consciousness, it was saying that this dialectic of the master and slave now is on a single individual. It's in the individual as the unhappy consciousness. So Stoicism, it seemed like he was saying Stoicism is the pure consciousness. It's true because I think it's true. So it would be the pure consciousness, and I guess skepticism would be the other side.
Yeah.
Where it's reaching out into existence and negating it. Would that be right?
Yeah, in part. I mean, with the skepticism part, it's it's not just negating the external world. It's also the realization that one's own position is a position that's being staked out as an individual, and thereby that can be negated as well. There's no universality to it. And so the skeptic is placed in this kind of unhappy, affective condition, which then can lead to the unhappy consciousness. Hegel, I mean, in a way, Hegel, he's doing his typical kind of schematic thing. You know, we got this following this, right?
Yeah.
He does say that Stoicism, which is the first part of that section, can only arise once you actually have a society in which sort of servitude has become universal. And you can think of, complex societies in which everybody is stuck working for somebody, and even the guy at the top has a crappy time. So he's got in mind like the Roman Empire, or the Macedonian successor states too, which are going through something similar. With the unhappy consciousness, so you can say that there is, something that, let's call it like an introjection of the master there, but then it's projected out as this object of desire that you're trying to reconnect with, and there what Hegel has in mind are all these different religious, let's call them experiments in antiquity, for how do you actually reach what is most real, what is divine. You try out philosophy first, and after that doesn't really work for you, then maybe let's try some Mithraism or cult of Isis or whatever you want. And he even has like a little passage there on what some church-going people call smells and bells. Using all these rituals and things like that. Let me take this question that's here in the chat from Junatan. Has there been any notable critique of this dialectic from other philosophers? I mean, there's not only has there been interesting critique of it, there's been a lot of interesting appropriation of it. So if we're thinking about critique, it would be that people are saying, okay, society doesn't really develop this way, or this isn't really fundamental or basic, or Hegel is getting something wrong. I would say that one of the people who's implicitly criticizing this over and over again is Nietzsche. Because for Nietzsche, the class of the masters, they're not just making the slaves do something and then just like sitting around all day. They're the ones who impose values, and it's the slave and the slave's development that produces this whole modern decadent culture of ressentiment. So I would say Nietzsche is probably one of the strongest critics. But you see other people incorporating it into their ideas. So Marx, in his way, is incorporating it. You could see what Freud is doing in Civilization and its discontents. It's talking about, this is all, the Freud stuff is all kind of like, let's imagine things were like this. I don't think that Freud really believed that there was some sort of primal horde or something like that, any more than Hegel thinks that most societies began with a master-slave dialectic. That's exactly the way he described. But it's a nice story. And so the function of repression and having to work on things is kind of similar there. Sartre, interestingly, who probably really liked this the most is Jean-Paul Sartre. Because he sees human relations, at least in being and nothingness, as almost completely doomed to falling into something like the master-slave dialectic or something similarly problematic for everybody involved. There's no possibility of attaining any genuine recognition in Sartre that ever holds up. And then other people are critical of Sartre for that reason. I think it's important, too, to remember that for Hegel, this is just the very beginning of the self-consciousness section, and then that feeds into reason and spirit, and there's much more complex dialectics of recognition being worked out in those. So this isn't where we go to find Hegel's full theory of recognition. If it was, then it would be a pretty dismal result, right? I would, if you ask me, well, master-slave dialectic, pick one. Are you going to be the master or the slave? I don't know. I suppose it's better to be the slave in a way because you're developing, but developing towards what? There has to be something more there.
The unhappy consciousness.
Well, that's not. Yeah, that's no picnic either.
Yeah.
So,
that would come next after the master-slave.
Yeah.
It's the unhappy consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the real key to this is, it is pointing out that we do develop through having to be put to work on things. I think that's an important lesson to learn from this. And that it requires not just our own decision, I'm going to, master a language or something like that. That's what we're able to do when we're like independent beings, right?
Yeah.
But we often develop precisely because people make us, they force us or compel us into situations, and they're not themselves necessarily wanting us to develop because we should improve our being or something like that. They just want us to do X for them, So a boss may send you to a seminar on emotional intelligence because they want you to quit getting in arguments with your coworkers, right? But that's still going to help you, if you take the seminar and subject yourself to it,
Yeah.
So, yeah. Any other questions or lines of discussion or comments?
Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay. First of all, thanks to all the friends to be part of it, because the class is really good. You told Professor Gregory that recognition is a necessity, right? So perhaps it could be the thing that makes us so beautiful in nature, but at the same time is our greatest problem, because in the search for recognition we get into this objective mode, maybe, and we just can't get out from that. And to achieve this holistic view that Hegel is trying to persuade us to, that is the only mode that really can make us to achieve the truth, right? The self-consciousness as pure as it can be. Why it's so hard for us to get out from this desperation for recognition and get into this unstoppable trying to persuade others to see ourselves as the essence, right? And not, you get what I mean, right?
Yeah,
right.
And that's a very fundamental question, I think, at the basis of, if there is an ethics in Hegel, recognition is at the center of it. And it gets worked out in different ways, where we could say it's like made available to us in different ways. And I suppose one of the issues is we don't just want recognition, we want it in the way that we want it, from the people when we want it, and we also, there's a secondary problem. If we want to get it, we also need to give it to other people, or else there isn't going to be this kind of free, open exchange. So if I compel you to recognize me, here's a great example. The professor in the classroom who needs to be the big shot and smarter than everybody else and tell them how it is, and they're often terrible teachers, right? And students see through that fairly quickly. They say, "Don't take this guy; he's terrible." But then the people who are stuck in his class, they see that he's looking for something from them, but he's not willing to give anything back except on his terms. That can't ultimately work. And so Hegel, he doesn't give us a complete answer for what what a completely reciprocal recognition would actually be like. But he's sketching out more and more developed ways in which we can get closer to that. And then I think we, in the present, have to do the work to think about what this would look like in general, and then what this would look like in terms of specific institutions. So this is actually getting kind of far, but I would say it's good to think about this in terms of particular fields of our life. So when you go into a store to buy some products, and you are engaged in an economic transaction, and the storekeeper, because it's a small business, there's a lot of potential for recognition to be taking part on both sides. Does he give you a fair deal? Do you treat him as if he's not, just there to dispense things for you? These are possibilities. Teaching provides another different example. I would say that romantic relationships also provide another very important example, or what happens within families and generations, as children become older and have to be actually treated as adults, not just as extensions of ourselves, which is very difficult for many parents, I think. So we can come up with lots and lots of fields in which what you're talking about takes place. But there's all these possible pitfalls that have to do with, for Hegel, the very structure of consciousness. Like, we don't want to go back to something like a master-slave dialectic. We want to have something where we can have stable relationships with people that are not just based on coercion, right? So that's not a full answer to your question, which is a very big question. But
I'm sorry, but it was fairly good, Professor Gregory, and I think the first step would be we recognize that we need to get recognition, and from that on, we can be more conscious in the trying to find healthy ways to get this recognition that's so vital and so central to our being, right?
Yeah, I think that makes very good sense. So that is something people often ask. Well, what do I do with Hegel when I read him? I've got this big thick book, and it's got all these different dialectical progressions, and they're hard as hell to understand. But let's say now I've understood them, and I see this whole development of consciousness through history. What do I do with that? And I think some of the answer to that would be, well, you take some of the individual lessons and you introject them into your own concrete existence. So realizing that we do have that fundamental desire for recognition, which I think Hegel's right about. Yeah, go ahead.
I have one question. Could recognition, it seems like something that you have those kind of dynamics all through your life, from childhood and friendship and respect. But could you have like negative and positive recognition, like hate, stuff like that, disrespect? If you have respect, you have disrespect. If you have love, you have hate.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a recognition. Any kind of dynamic, I think, with humans, it's kind of like something like a recognition.
Well, that's interesting because so I'll bring up two people. One is Hobbes. Hobbes talks about love and hate, and then contempt. And he says contempt is fundamentally different than either of those. It's you don't take any account of that person whatsoever, right?
Yeah, it didn't reserve respect at all.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, contempt hurts them more than outright hatred does. And so the other person I was going to bring up is Nietzsche. Nietzsche seems to think that, at least if somebody hates you, if they hate you in the right way, they're still acknowledging you as you.
Yeah, it's respect. It's just like pity. Pity is a kind of contempt to me. If somebody pity you, they don't respect you. You're beneath them. They think they're better than you, so they pity you.
Yeah. Now, of course, I mean, it still wouldn't be as good as actually, say, being loved or
Yeah.
having, like having a colleague who you seek out and want to work with or something like
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
But you're right. There we could distinguish gradations in this. Jun Natan has another question. Do I think there might be a connection with the disciplinary regimes of the 20th century, totalitarian regimes, gulags, Arbeit macht frei, etc., progress by forcing people into the role of the slave for their own good? So with the master-slave dialectic, this is actually a great question because this is where I would say the master-slave dialectic itself doesn't really have that component, but some of the other later dialectics could, like when we get into the spirit section and we get freedom and the terror, talking about the French Revolution, where it's precisely this Rousseauian, we need to make people be free, and we have to do so, if need be, by, terrorizing them and guillotining them. Now, that's not 20th century totalitarian regimes, which are still yet more complex in that way. But the French Revolution, you might say, gets that kind of thing going. This notion of, like you're saying, forcing people into the role of the slave for their own good. A lot of the totalitarian regimes didn't arise solely because capitalism had failed, or people just like ruling other people or things like that. It was in part because they were a way to respond to the problem of class conflict, which was tearing societies apart. And then there's another sort of inherent dynamic driving it forward. In terms, like on the left of history's on our side, on the right terms of race and identity on the basis of race, and I think that's not the what could go on in the master-slave dialectic would be the development of the slave, right? So if you think about, let's say we take somebody who was formed by those kind of experiences, Solzhenitsyn, right? Solzhenitsyn was stuck in the gulags, unfortunately, after making a joke about Stalin in a letter, and he got sent there, and somehow was able to get all of this information out. Some of it was on notes, but a lot of it was memorized. And if you think about the sort of discipline that was required for some guy who was just a tank, officer, and had some literacy to be able to do that, he made it through a crucible that none of us would want to go through, and none of us would want to put another person through. But it did reform him. So you could say that the master-slave dialectic reworking of the slave could fit in there.
Yeah.
But I think the masters in totalitarian regimes are after something more than just enjoyment. I mean, some of them are just about enjoyment. You think about like somebody like Goering, for example, in the Nazi regime, right?
Yeah.
He was a bon vivant, and if that meant that he had to crack a few heads, he was okay with that. But somebody like Goebbels, totally ascetic, not about enjoyment at all. It was about power and ideology and domination. So so I think the later discussions would have more to bear on that stuff that's coming up in the spirit section. But even then, I mean, Hegel doesn't really. I don't think he really foresees what happened in the 20th century. He can be used to explain some of it, but I don't think he sufficiently. I mean, how could he have thought that sort of stuff out? Right? I mean, we can't hold him any more than we can hold Descartes or Aristotle responsible for conceptualizing a century that didn't exist at the time.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? We can take maybe another minute or two.
Professor Gregory, could we talk about this twofold action? How Hegel sees the proper way in which we created the dialectic,
Yeah.
instead of the objective.
Okay.
I think we talk a bit about that, but
Yeah. I think one thing to keep in mind is Hegel's not talking about this there, but there's other people who've thought about this, like in terms of what we might call overdetermination. Every action that you engage in, you have some intention about what you're trying to do, right? And that might be kind of vague. Usually it refers to not just the immediate thing that you're doing, like I'm making dinner. I'm making dinner for who? For my children. Why? Because they have to eat. And I want to keep Child Protective Services from coming in and blah, blah, blah. Right? So you have this whole matrix. But there's not just that, how the capacity to unpack what the action and the motive is. Every time that you're acting in relation to another person, you're doing something, and you're also, in a way, saying something about the relationship and how you view them or how you think they view you, and they're doing something similar too. This is why couples, if you want to get in a fight with your romantic partner, you can always find a reason, because you can read anything. You can always read something in the wrong way, right? Or, a business partner or whoever, right? So there's always a surplus of meaning that goes beyond any one single aspect of it. And when we're talking about looking for recognition from the other person, it gets even more complicated, because, let's say we think in terms of our demand for recognition, or articulating a desire for recognition. So that's an action on our part, but there's also an action on their part in being receptive to that, or choosing to dismiss it. And then we're also looking to what their actions are towards us. So these things can. So you notice when we're analyzing, it's getting very complicated, right? We do this implicitly all the time in each of the exchanges that we're having with other people, whether we realize it or not. We're the kind of animal that does this and learns to do it. I mean, some people in human society don't, and they're usually very low functioning. And we say, well, don't trust them with this job or that job because they can't deal with people, right? But most of us do this without even really thinking about it. We often screw it up. We get into fights with each other. We have bad feelings about what the other person is doing, sometimes without a good basis. But it's there's a lot of room there for improvement, you might say. All right. Go ahead. I was going to say we can wrap this up. So I do have some other things coming up that I thought I would mention. In July, I'm going to be tackling Sartre on freedom and responsibility. In August, we're going to do another, free webinar on Plato, on love, sex, and politics. So that means the symposium, right? September, I'm going to do some Mary Wollstonecraft, and then October, which is the month that it contains Stoic Week and Stoicon, I'll focus on one of the Stoics again, and Epictetus on choice and character.